Rain slammed against the windows like fists demanding to be heard. A frightened boy stood in a pitch-black apartment, watching his father tremble in front of a broken fuse box, a man who once fixed entire buildings now afraid to touch a single wire. Sparks exploded. The flashlight flickered. Silence pressed into the room like a weight neither of them could escape. Months earlier, that same man had buried his wife. Weeks earlier, a brutal electrical accident had shattered his confidence. And tonight, he believed he had failed the only person who still called him hero. Then the boy stepped forward and whispered 6 words that would change everything. "Dad, I can see the light." But there was no light in the room. Only grief. Only darkness. Only a broken man. And a child who still believed he could become whole again. This is not just a story about loss. It is a story about the wisdom children carry, the invisible wounds fathers hide, and the quiet discipline that rebuilds a life, one small act at a time. Michael Turner believed that broken things were simply stories waiting for patient hands. Every morning before sunrise, he woke quietly so he wouldn't disturb his family. The small apartment smelled faintly of machine oil and brewed coffee, a scent Ethan would later associate with safety. Michael moved with steady purpose, checking his worn toolbox, tightening loose screws, wiping each instrument like a musician preparing for a performance. He wasn't rich. He wasn't famous. But in the neighborhoods where wires tangled like stubborn thoughts and power flickered without warning, Michael was known as a man who could bring light back into darkness. And every evening, no matter how exhausted he was, he came home smiling. The moment he opened the apartment door, Ethan would run toward him, holding up half-built toy cars or broken gadgets rescued from the trash. Michael never brushed him off. He dropped his heavy tool belt, washed his hands slowly, and knelt at the kitchen table. "Show me what you've got," he would say. Together, they worked under a small yellow lamp while Sarah cooked nearby, humming songs that turned the cramped space into something warm and alive. She often teased Michael about teaching their son to fix everything. "One day he'll try to repair the whole world," she laughed. Michael always answered gently, "That's not a bad thing." Their evenings followed a rhythm that felt permanent: dinner, laughter, small lessons disguised as play. When Ethan grew frustrated because a toy wouldn't fit together properly, Michael guided his hands. "Slow down," he said softly. "Rushing breaks things. Care fixes them." Ethan listened carefully, not realizing those words would someday become anchors during storms much bigger than toy cars. Before bed, they followed a ritual that meant everything to them. Michael switched off the lights until the room sank into complete darkness. Ethan would giggle nervously at first, then wait for the familiar words. "Even in the dark," Michael whispered. "We find our way," Ethan finished proudly. It was more than a phrase. It was a promise, one that made the world feel safe. Sarah was the balance in their home. A nurse who worked long hours, she carried compassion like a second heartbeat. She listened deeply, spoke gently, and believed that small acts of kindness could change entire lives. When Michael grew too serious, she reminded him to laugh. When Ethan felt scared, she held him until his worries softened. Their family wasn't perfect. Bills were sometimes tight, arguments occasionally sharp, but love filled every corner. On weekends, Michael brought Ethan along to simple repair jobs. He never let his son touch dangerous tools, but he explained everything with patience. "Electricity follows the path you give it," he said one afternoon while pointing to wires inside a panel. "If the path is messy, things go wrong. Same with life. Choose your direction carefully." Ethan nodded, not fully understanding but feeling the importance in his father's voice. Storms fascinated Ethan but terrified him too. Whenever thunder shook the apartment, he ran to Michael's side. Instead of dismissing his fear, Michael sat beside him at the window. "Fear," he explained, "is just darkness talking loudly. Courage is taking one small step anyway." Those words settled quietly into Ethan's memory, waiting for a future neither of them could imagine. Even small moments carried lessons. When Michael made mistakes at work, misjudging a measurement or needing to redo a job, he spoke openly about it. "Mistakes aren't proof you're weak," he told Ethan. "They're proof you tried. The real failure is refusing to try again." Sarah watched these conversations with a soft smile. She often said that Michael didn't just fix wires, he built character. Life felt steady, predictable, safe. Until one evening when the sky turned grey earlier than usual. Rain tapped against the windows as Sarah prepared for a late-night hospital shift. She moved around the kitchen with practiced efficiency, packing snacks, double-checking her bag, kissing Ethan's cheek. "Be good for your dad," she said warmly. Michael pretended to complain about her long hours, but his eyes carried pride. "Don't work too hard," she teased him in return. "And please, rest that wrist." He had recently strained it during a difficult repair job. Michael shrugged off the concern with a small smile. "I'll be fine," he said. Ethan watched from the doorway as his mother grabbed her coat. She paused for a moment, as if sensing something heavy in the air, then turned back to hug them both longer than usual. "I love you," she whispered. The door closed behind her, and none of them realized it would be the last time they heard her voice. That evening felt ordinary. Michael and Ethan finished building a toy truck. They ate leftovers. They laughed at a silly television show. The routine wrapped around them like a familiar blanket. Before bed, Michael turned off the lights. Even in the dark. "We find our way," Ethan whispered sleepily. Hours later, the phone rang. Michael answered casually at first, expecting a work call. But as he listened, his expression changed slowly, confusion turning into disbelief, disbelief collapsing into silent horror. Ethan woke up to the sound of something heavy falling to the floor. He found his father sitting motionless, the phone hanging loosely from his hand. Tears didn't come immediately. Instead, a strange stillness filled the room, like the air had forgotten how to move. Michael struggled to speak. There had been an accident. A reckless driver. A red light ignored. A collision no one survived. Sarah was gone. The days that followed blurred into funeral arrangements, whispered condolences, and a house that suddenly felt enormous and empty. Michael moved like a ghost through familiar spaces, touching objects that still carried Sarah's warmth. Ethan watched his father carefully, waiting for the strong man who always knew what to do. But grief had entered quietly, dismantling routines piece by piece. The kitchen table remained cluttered with unfinished projects. The laughter disappeared. Nights grew silent. Yet even in the early days of loss, Ethan held onto his father's words like small glowing lights inside his chest. "Choose your path carefully. Mistakes mean you tried. Courage is one small step." Before we go deeper, stories like this take time and care to craft. Stories meant to stay with you long after the video ends. If you value wisdom that can quietly change your life, subscribe and stay with us. Now, let's continue. And every night, even when his voice shook, Michael continued their ritual. Even in the dark. "We find our way," Ethan whispered, not fully understanding that the darkness they were entering would test those words more than either of them could imagine. Grief did not arrive loudly. It did not crash through the apartment like thunder or scream its presence into their lives. Instead, it slipped quietly into corners, into empty chairs, untouched coffee cups, and the silence between sentences that were never finished. The morning after Sarah's funeral, Michael woke before sunrise out of habit. For a few fragile seconds, everything felt normal. He reached across the bed, expecting warmth. There was nothing there. The realization came slowly, like cold water spreading through his chest. He sat up and stared at the wall, trying to breathe through a world that no longer made sense. Ethan woke later and stood in the doorway, watching his father. The boy had never seen Michael so still. Usually mornings were full of movement, coffee brewing, tools clinking, music playing softly. Now the apartment felt heavy, as if even sound was afraid to exist. "Are we okay?" Ethan asked quietly. Michael forced a small smile. "We will be," he answered, though he wasn't sure if he believed it. In the beginning, Michael tried to keep everything normal. He packed Ethan's lunch, helped with homework, and repeated their bedtime ritual every night. But grief has a way of loosening routine slowly, like screws turning themselves free. He began waking later. Meals became simpler. Conversations shorter. Some evenings, Michael sat at the kitchen table long after Ethan went to bed, staring at Sarah's empty chair. He replayed memories endlessly. The way she laughed, the way she reminded him to slow down, the way she always believed in him. The world outside kept moving, neighbors laughing, cars honking, electricity humming through buildings he once repaired, but inside the apartment, time felt frozen. Ethan noticed everything. He noticed when his father forgot to eat. He noticed when unfinished repair tools gathered dust near the door. He noticed the absence of music. Still, he tried to help in small ways. He washed dishes without being asked. He built toy cars quietly on his own. And sometimes, he repeated his father's old wisdom out loud, hoping it might reach him. "Mistakes aren't failure," Ethan said one afternoon while struggling with homework. He looked toward Michael for encouragement, but his father barely looked up. Michael wanted to be present. He wanted to be strong. But grief clouded his thoughts like heavy fog. Concentrating felt impossible. Even simple tasks drained him. Bills began arriving more frequently than paychecks. At first, he ignored them. Then he stacked them neatly in a drawer, promising himself he would deal with everything tomorrow. Tomorrow became next week. Next week became silence. One evening, the electricity flickered and shut off completely. Ethan froze, remembering storms and fear. But this time there was no thunder, only the quiet click of unpaid consequences. Michael sat in darkness, holding a flashlight that felt heavier than any tool he had ever carried. For the first time, he realized he was losing control not just of his emotions, but of their stability. "I'll fix this," he said weakly. But fixing things required energy he didn't have. The following days blurred together. Michael missed work calls. He declined small repair jobs because the thought of facing people felt overwhelming. He began doubting skills he had mastered for years. One afternoon, Ethan found him sitting in the hallway surrounded by unopened mail. "Dad?" Ethan asked gently. Michael forced himself to stand. "Just tired," he said. But exhaustion wasn't the whole truth. Beneath it was something heavier. Shame. The kind that whispers you are failing everyone you love. Neighbors began asking questions. Friends offered help. Michael smiled politely and insisted they were fine. Accepting help felt like admitting weakness, and weakness felt dangerous when he was supposed to be Ethan's protector. Yet even in his lowest moments, fragments of his old wisdom slipped through. One evening, Ethan confessed he felt scared of the future. Michael hesitated before answering. His voice trembled slightly, but his words remained steady. "Fear is just darkness talking loudly," he said. "We don't fight darkness with panic. We take one small step." Ethan nodded, holding on to those words tightly. He noticed that when Michael shared advice, his eyes briefly looked like they used to, clear, determined, alive. But those moments were becoming rare. Grief changed the way Michael saw himself. He began replaying Sarah's final moments endlessly, wondering what he could have done differently. If he should have driven her to work that night, if he should have called more often, if he should have insisted she rest. Guilt built invisible walls around him. He stopped fixing things around the apartment. A leaking faucet dripped endlessly. A broken lamp sat untouched. The once organized toolbox gathered dust. Ethan tried to help by cleaning and organizing the tools one afternoon. When Michael saw them arranged neatly, something inside him broke open, not in anger, but in sadness. "I used to know how to fix everything," he whispered. Ethan looked at him carefully. "You still do," he said softly. Michael wanted to believe him. But self-doubt had begun replacing confidence. As weeks passed, the apartment grew quieter. Even their bedtime ritual began to fade. Some nights Michael forgot to say the words. Some nights Ethan whispered them alone into darkness. "Even in the dark, we find our way." He repeated it not because he felt strong, but because he hoped his father would remember who he used to be. Outside, life continued moving forward. Inside, Michael felt trapped in a moment that refused to end. Yet beneath the silence, something important remained alive, the wisdom he had planted in Ethan during brighter days. Lessons about courage, patience, and small steps were slowly becoming the boy's inner voice. Neither of them knew that soon, Michael would attempt to return to work, not out of strength, but out of desperation. And that decision would lead to the accident that shattered his confidence completely. But for now, the apartment sat in quiet grief, two people learning how heavy silence could become when love was still present but hope felt far away. The decision to return to work did not come from strength. It came from a stack of unpaid bills, a landlord's polite but firm warning, and the quiet realization that Ethan was beginning to grow used to darkness, both literal and emotional. One morning, Michael stared at his dusty toolbox for a long time before opening it. The familiar smell of metal and oil filled the room, pulling memories from a life that felt like someone else's. Ethan watched from the kitchen table. "You're going back?" he asked carefully. Michael hesitated. His hands trembled slightly as he checked his tools. "Just a small job," he said. "Nothing big." The words sounded confident, but inside he felt hollow. The thought of stepping back into crowded work sites, of people expecting the old dependable Michael Turner, filled him with quiet dread. Before leaving, he knelt beside Ethan, something he hadn't done in weeks. "Remember," he said softly, trying to sound like himself again, "strong people don't wait to feel ready. They start small." Ethan nodded. He noticed the return of his father's old tone, calm, instructive, gentle. It felt like seeing a faint light flicker back to life. Michael's first few jobs were simple repairs for neighbors, a broken outlet, a faulty ceiling fan, a flickering hallway light. He moved slowly, double-checking everything, afraid of making even the smallest mistake. Each completed task gave him a tiny spark of confidence, but it never lasted long. Doubt followed him everywhere. One afternoon, his former supervisor called with a larger assignment, a repair job at an aging industrial warehouse on the edge of the city. The building had outdated wiring and frequent power failures. The pay was good. The deadline tight. Michael almost declined. But the bills on his kitchen counter felt heavier than fear. He told himself that work would help him regain control, that stepping back into his old environment might remind him who he used to be. The morning of the job, Ethan stood by the door watching him prepare. "You always say electricity follows the path you give it," Ethan said quietly. "So today, give yourself a good path." Michael managed a small smile. "You've been listening." "I always listen," Ethan answered. Those words stayed with Michael as he drove to the warehouse. The building looked worn and tired, like it had survived too many storms. Rust stained the walls. Loose wires hung from ceilings like forgotten thoughts. The smell of dust and old machinery filled the air. He worked alone in a dim electrical room filled with tangled cables and outdated panels. At first, the motions felt familiar, checking circuits, testing voltage, mapping out repairs. Muscle memory guided him even when his mind drifted. But grief has a way of distracting even the most experienced hands. As he worked, memories of Sarah flooded in unexpectedly. Her laughter, her last hug, the promise she made to come home for breakfast. His chest tightened. His focus slipped for just a moment. He overlooked a small but critical warning sign, a section of wiring that still carried live current despite being labeled inactive. Michael reached into the panel. The world exploded into light. A violent surge of electricity ripped through the system. Sparks burst like fireworks in a dark sky. The force threw him backward into a concrete wall. Pain shot through his body as tools clattered across the floor. For a few terrifying seconds, everything went silent except for the ringing in his ears. When he regained consciousness, emergency lights flickered weakly around him. His hands shook uncontrollably. Burn marks covered his gloves. The smell of scorched metal filled the room. Paramedics later said he was lucky. The shock could have killed him instantly. Physically, Michael recovered faster than anyone expected. Bruises faded. Cuts healed. Doctors cleared him to return to light duties within weeks. But inside, something fundamental had changed. The accident shattered the fragile confidence he had begun rebuilding. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw sparks exploding. He felt the surge again, heard the deafening crack of electricity snapping through wires. His hands began trembling whenever he picked up tools. Back home, Ethan noticed the difference immediately. Michael avoided his toolbox. He jumped at sudden noises. He sat for long periods staring at nothing, lost in memories he couldn't escape. One evening, Ethan asked gently, "Are you scared?" Michael hesitated. He had always taught his son that fear was normal, that courage meant facing it. But now those words felt heavy. "Yes," he admitted quietly. "I am." Ethan sat beside him, remembering his father's old lessons. "You said courage is one small step," he whispered. Michael nodded, but doubt filled his eyes. The man who once worked confidently in dangerous environments now questioned every decision. He worried that returning to work might put him, or others, at risk. Soon, he stopped accepting jobs altogether. Without income, bills returned like unwelcome shadows. Electricity in their apartment flickered again. Tools gathered dust once more. Michael felt trapped between guilt for not providing and fear of repeating the accident. At night, he replayed the moment endlessly, wondering how he could have missed the warning sign, how he could have been so careless. Shame grew heavier each day. Yet Ethan never blamed him. Instead, the boy listened carefully whenever his father spoke, even when the words were few. He held on to every piece of wisdom Michael had ever shared, repeating them silently like quiet prayers. Choose your path carefully. Mistakes mean you tried. Courage is one small step. But Michael struggled to believe his own lessons anymore. The apartment grew darker, not only because of unpaid bills, but because hope felt fragile and distant. The strong man who once built light for others now felt powerless in his own home. Neither of them knew that a storm was coming, one that would force Michael to confront his fears again. One that would lead to the moment when Ethan would speak the words that changed everything. But for now, Michael sat surrounded by silence, holding tools he no longer trusted, a man haunted by sparks that refused to fade. The days after the accident passed like a slow, suffocating fog. Michael tried to return to normal life. He tried, truly, to act as if nothing had changed. But the moment he picked up his tools, his hand shook so violently that he dropped them. The familiar metallic clink of wrenches and screwdrivers once brought him calm, certainty, even pride. Now, it felt like punishment, a reminder of the moment when a single misstep nearly ended everything. He stopped going to work. Friends offered small jobs, neighbors suggested quick repairs, but Michael declined each one with a polite smile and a hollow excuse. Pride, shame, and fear entwined like heavy chains around his chest. Bills stacked up, unpaid. Notices from the electric company arrived like grim messengers, each one a reminder of failure. Soon, the apartment was plunged into darkness more often than not. Fuses blown, service cut, the small yellow lamp on the kitchen table flickered and died. Ethan noticed everything. The boy moved quietly around the apartment, sometimes cleaning, sometimes finishing small chores his father had left undone. He fixed the small things Michael could no longer manage, the dripping faucet, the broken drawer handle, the weak light bulb in the hallway. And still, he watched. He watched Michael sit in silence for hours. Watched the man who once carried so much confidence now crumble under invisible weight. Watched as the hands that built and repaired so many things trembled at the simplest tasks. Watched as Michael's laughter faded into quiet sighs. Yet even in the darkest moments, Ethan remembered the lessons his father had taught him. Courage is one small step. Mistakes aren't failure. Even in the dark, we find our way. He whispered them to himself quietly, holding on to them like fragile light in a shadowed room. Michael noticed, sometimes, a faint smile, a brief look of pride. But mostly, he withdrew, lost in memories of Sarah and regrets of what he couldn't fix, at work, at home, and in himself. Night times were the worst. Without electricity, the apartment became an arena of silence and shadow. The cold crept through walls, and the darkness seemed endless. Michael sat at the kitchen table for hours, staring at the blank wall, reliving the spark of the accident. He saw it over and over, the flash of light, the violent surge, the sharp pain. Each replay deepened the sense of failure. Ethan would lie awake in his small bed, listening to the quiet breathing of his father. Sometimes, he whispered the nightly ritual alone. Even in the dark, we find our way. And somewhere, deep inside Michael, the words echoed faintly, a fragile reminder of what he had once been. Days stretched into weeks. Michael's attempts at normalcy became fewer. He skipped meals, neglected bills, avoided calls. He had become a man who moved like a shadow, a man weighed down by guilt and fear, a man who doubted he could ever be whole again. One afternoon, the boy finally spoke. "Dad, do you remember when you taught me how to fix the lamp?" Ethan asked softly. Michael's hands were folded in his lap. He looked at the boy, unsure what to say. I think I can fix things too," Ethan continued, his voice quiet but determined. "You taught me how." Michael's chest tightened. His son, barely a child, but already wise beyond his years, believed in him, even when he had stopped believing in himself. That evening, the electricity went out again. The darkness seemed complete, absolute. Michael lit a small flashlight, but its weak beam did little to pierce the gloom. He shuffled to the fuse box and stared at it, hands trembling. His mind replayed the warehouse accident once more. He feared sparks, feared failure, feared hurting himself again. "Don't try it," he whispered. Ethan came closer, silently. The boy's small hand rested on his father's shoulder. "It's okay, Dad," he said softly. "We can figure it out together. You taught me courage. Remember." Michael froze. The words weren't a command. They were a lifeline. Something shifted, just slightly, deep inside. He realized his son hadn't stopped believing in him. Not once. Ethan didn't need perfection, didn't demand grand gestures. He needed presence, effort, the quiet rebuilding of a life. That night, Michael didn't fix the fuse. But he sat with Ethan at the kitchen table. They lit candles. They talked about the day, about small victories, about mistakes that could teach lessons. It was the first time in months Michael felt something other than despair. A spark, faint, almost invisible, flickered in his chest. Over the following weeks, he started small routines. One task finished fully before starting another. One note of encouragement tucked into Ethan's backpack each morning. One brief moment of laughter each evening. Some days, grief hit like a tidal wave, leaving him gasping for air. Some days, the apartment remained dark because bills were unpaid. But each time he tried again, Ethan's words returned. "Dad, I can see the light." The boy's voice became a compass, a steady guide through the darkness that had swallowed Michael whole. It reminded him that even in the worst storms, even when all seemed lost, effort mattered. Small, consistent effort mattered. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, life began to move forward. The apartment grew warmer. Candles were replaced with light bulbs. Dusty tools were picked up and arranged. Laughter returned, soft, hesitant, but alive. Michael understood something important. Healing wasn't instantaneous. It didn't come from grand gestures. It came from showing up, again and again. From small acts of discipline. From allowing hope to grow quietly through daily effort. And Ethan, who had listened to every lesson he had ever taught, became stronger, wiser, more patient. The boy's faith in his father never wavered, and that faith began to pull Michael out of his darkest hours. But outside, the storm was still coming. And one night, that storm would force both father and son to face the darkest moment of all, and reveal the light that had never truly gone out. The storm rolled in without warning, as if the sky itself knew the weight pressing down on their small apartment. Rain pounded against the windows like relentless fists, rattling the panes and sending shivers through the walls. The wind howled around the building, and the occasional flash of lightning lit up the room in stark white bursts, followed by the deep rumble of thunder that seemed to shake the very foundation of their home. Inside, Michael sat hunched at the kitchen table. A weak flashlight cast trembling shadows across the room, illuminating dusty tools, scattered papers, and the half-finished toy cars Ethan had been quietly assembling. The man who once navigated the most dangerous currents of electricity with confidence now hesitated to touch a single wire. Fear, guilt, and exhaustion had fused into something heavy inside him. "I can't do this," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Ethan approached silently, holding a small candle. Its flickering flame trembled in the drafty room, but to the boy, it was enough to make the darkness less absolute. "Dad," Ethan said softly, standing just behind him. "It's okay. We'll be fine." Michael didn't look up. His hands hovered near the fuse box, trembling so violently that he nearly dropped the flashlight. Sparks from previous attempts had left him wary. Every movement felt dangerous, like a reminder of the warehouse accident that had shattered his confidence months earlier. He swallowed hard, attempting to steady himself. "You don't understand," he whispered, voice cracking. "I can't. I'll just make it worse. I've failed you enough already." Ethan stepped closer. He reached for his father's shoulder, small hand steady despite the storm raging outside. "You taught me that courage is one small step," he said. His voice was quiet but unwavering. "You taught me that mistakes aren't failure. You've always said that trying again is what matters. So, I know you can." Michael froze. He wanted to argue, wanted to tell his son he was wrong, that he wasn't capable. But in Ethan's eyes, he saw something he hadn't noticed in months: hope. Pure, unwavering belief. A tiny spark flickered inside him, small but insistent. "You believe in me?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the storm. Ethan nodded, lips pressed together in a serious expression beyond his years. "I've always believed in you, Dad. You don't need to be perfect. Just try. That's enough." Michael's chest tightened. He felt tears pooling, though he hadn't realized he had been holding them back. The storm outside raged like a mirror of the turmoil inside him, but for the first time in months, he felt something rise above the fear. Slowly, he knelt before the fuse box. Hands shaking, he touched the wires, checked connections, and remembered the techniques he had spent a lifetime mastering. Each spark that flickered across the panel no longer felt threatening. It felt like a signal, a challenge he could meet. Ethan knelt beside him, guiding his hands when necessary, but mostly staying quiet. His presence alone gave Michael the courage to continue. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Sweat mixed with rain dripping from the window, and Michael's heart pounded in his chest. He thought of Sarah, her laughter, her gentle instructions, the love that had once filled the apartment. And he thought of the wisdom he had shared with Ethan, lessons he had once doubted, now returning to steady him. Finally, after careful adjustments and repeated checks, Michael heard the familiar hum of electricity returning. Lights flickered back on, one by one, until the apartment was fully illuminated. Ethan's face broke into a wide smile. "See," he whispered, voice bright and full of wonder. "It's okay. You did it." Michael looked down at his son, tears streaming freely now. He realized something profound. The light had never really left their home. It had been inside them all along. Not in the wires, not in the bulbs, in the courage to keep trying, in the small acts of effort, in the love that refused to give up. Ethan reached up and touched his father's arm. "Dad, I can see the light," he said simply, softly, as if speaking a magic spell. Michael froze. It wasn't a literal light, yet in that moment, it shone brighter than anything he had ever witnessed. He understood at last. Ethan had never needed perfection. He had never demanded it. He had only needed his father to show up, to try, to be present, to keep moving forward even when it hurt. For the first time in months, Michael laughed, a deep, relieved laugh that filled the room. Ethan joined him, and together, they let the sound mingle with the rumbling storm outside. That night marked a turning point. The storm passed, leaving their small apartment quiet, warm, and bright in a way it hadn't been for months. Michael finally understood the truth he had tried to teach his son for years. Light is not only found in tools, in work, or in solving problems. Light is found in presence, in effort, in consistency, and in the courage to try again even when failure seems certain. From that night forward, Michael began to rebuild, not just the apartment, not just his career, but himself. He woke early to guide Ethan in small ways, completed tasks fully before moving to the next, left encouraging notes in his son's backpack, and returned to work cautiously, allowing himself to regain confidence slowly. Some days were harder than others. Grief still struck like a wave, and the memory of Sarah sometimes felt unbearably close. But every time Michael felt weak, Ethan's words echoed in his mind. "Dad, I can see the light." It became a mantra, a compass, a guiding principle. Not just for Michael, but for Ethan too. The boy had learned that courage was quiet, resilience was subtle, and love was expressed through effort rather than perfection. The apartment, once a place of shadows and silence, now glowed. Not just with electricity, but with laughter, warmth, and the steady light of renewed hope. Tools were once again picked up, tasks completed, routines followed. Trust, fragile and battered, slowly rebuilt itself through daily consistency. And as father and son stood side by side that evening, looking out at the quiet aftermath of the storm, Michael realized something he hadn't admitted in months. The darkest nights are not the end. They are the beginning. The beginning of effort, presence, and rebuilding, the small steps that become the brightest light. In that quiet, glowing apartment, Michael whispered to Ethan, "Even in the dark." Ethan, smiling up at him, completed the sentence as he always had. "We find our way." And in that simple exchange, a father and son discovered the most profound truth of all. That light, the real, enduring light, has always been within them. The storm had passed, but its lesson lingered. For the first time in months, Michael Turner woke before dawn not out of habit or obligation, but with a quiet determination, the kind that grows slowly, unnoticed, until it fills every corner of life. Ethan slept peacefully, cocooned in blankets, unaware of the transformation beginning in his father. Michael moved around the apartment with deliberate care, touching each tool, each surface, as if reminding himself these spaces were his responsibility again, and that he could restore them, piece by piece. The first act of rebuilding was small, a broken chair by the kitchen table. Michael sanded it, tightened screws, applied wood polish with painstaking precision. He didn't rush. In every stroke, he repeated silently, one small step. Ethan awoke and watched, quietly, from the doorway. He had learned patience from his father, but now he saw it applied not in words, but in action. Michael didn't speak much, yet the boy understood. Effort mattered more than speed. Consistency mattered more than perfection. Presence mattered more than grand gestures. Breakfast was a quiet affair. Michael prepared eggs and toast, simple yet carefully done. For the first time in months, the kitchen smelled of warmth and care. He sat beside Ethan and offered guidance gently. "Remember," he said, "when you build something, you finish what you start. That's how trust is formed, with every small effort." Ethan smiled, nodding. The lesson sank deep, like sunlight penetrating clouds. He understood that his father's journey was not just about fixing appliances or wires, it was about fixing himself, and slowly, in turn, helping his son learn to navigate the world. The days unfolded in a pattern that Michael enforced with soft discipline. He woke early, completed one task fully before beginning the next, left notes of encouragement in Ethan's backpack. Progress grows quietly. Mistakes are proof you tried. Effort is light in darkness. Some days were victories. Others were setbacks. A blown fuse, a spilled cup of coffee, a wave of grief, all tested his patience. But with each step, Michael remembered Ethan's voice from the stormy night. "Dad, I can see the light." Slowly, the apartment transformed. Dusty surfaces gleamed. Tools were arranged neatly. Broken items were repaired. Light filled rooms that had once been shadows. More than electricity returned, laughter returned, tentative at first, then richer and freer. Ethan thrived in the change. He observed quietly, absorbing lessons not as lectures, but as lived examples. He learned the subtle art of patience, the power of trying again, the value of small, consistent effort. One afternoon, they worked together on a new project, building a small bookshelf for Ethan's growing collection of books. Michael guided each cut, each nail, each carefully measured board. When Ethan made a mistake, Michael didn't scold. He simply demonstrated the correction, gently, repeating the mantra, "Mistakes are proof you tried." Ethan nodded, corrected his technique, and together they rebuilt the shelf. The sense of accomplishment was profound, not because it was perfect, but because it was completed together. Evenings became their sanctuary. Candles and lamps provided gentle light while they worked on projects, read together, or simply talked. Michael reintroduced bedtime rituals. "Even in the dark," he whispered. "We find our way," Ethan replied. But now, the words carried deeper meaning. They weren't just repetition, they were acknowledgement of the effort, the resilience, the growth they both shared. Michael began returning to work cautiously. Small, safe repair jobs first, then slightly larger ones. Each completed task restored not just income, but confidence. Each successful repair reminded him that the spark he feared losing had never truly disappeared. Ethan noticed the change. The boy who had once silently endured his father's absence now witnessed him reclaim life, slowly, deliberately, courageously. And he absorbed lessons not from fear, but from observation, silently internalizing the wisdom Michael had once poured into him through playful guidance. One day, after a particularly long morning of fixing a neighbor's circuit, Michael and Ethan sat at the kitchen table, drinking cocoa. Michael's hands were still rough and calloused, but steadier than they had been in months. He looked at his son and said quietly, "You've been listening all this time, haven't you?" Ethan smiled. "I always listen," he replied, "even when you weren't saying anything." Michael realized then that the smallest seeds of wisdom often grow unseen. His lessons, about courage, persistence, patience, and presence, had taken root in Ethan, even while he himself had struggled to see the light. The apartment, once cold and dark, now radiated warmth. The walls echoed with laughter. Tools were no longer feared, they were instruments of rebuilding. The father who had been broken was gradually becoming whole, not through a sudden miracle, but through patience, effort, and the quiet consistency of showing up every day. Michael began sharing wisdom in small, intentional ways. Not as lectures, but as lived examples. When Ethan faced challenges at school or with friends, Michael didn't solve the problems for him. Instead, he guided, demonstrated, and encouraged, showing that effort and persistence were more valuable than perfection. The lessons he had taught so many times, even in the dark, we find our way, courage is one small step, mistakes are proof you tried, were no longer abstract. They were living truths, breathed into each day by a father and son navigating life together. Weeks turned into months. Slowly, the apartment became not only a place of light, but a home of resilience. Michael's routines were no longer forced. They were habits, small rituals that anchored both him and Ethan. Laughter was no longer tentative. It rang freely through the rooms. The darkness that had once felt suffocating now had a name: growth. Ethan had begun to internalize the wisdom his father had given him. He became observant, calm, and patient. He carried himself with quiet confidence and insight beyond his years. Friends noticed. Teachers noticed. And Michael, watching from the kitchen table one evening, understood something profound. The lessons he had imparted, even in the smallest, simplest ways, had shaped a life. A life that could carry light into the darkest hours. And Michael, who had once feared he had failed completely, learned the ultimate truth. It is never too late to rebuild, to try again, to shine, if you keep showing up, if you keep believing, if you keep taking small steps. In the quiet of the evening, Michael turned off the lights for the bedtime ritual. He whispered, even in the dark. Ethan, smiling up at him, finished. We find our way. The apartment glowed not just with electricity, but with effort, love, and the enduring light of a father and son who had learned that hope, like courage, grows one small step at a time. By the time spring arrived, the Turner apartment was no longer a place defined by darkness or fear. It was a home where light, both literal and metaphorical, radiated from every corner. Michael had returned to work steadily, cautiously, but with a newfound confidence. His hands, once trembling with doubt, now moved with deliberate precision. Each job completed was a small victory, a quiet reminder that he could still build, repair, and protect. Ethan noticed everything, as he always did. He watched his father wake early to prepare breakfast, organize tools, and plan the day ahead. He saw Michael handling challenges calmly, even when a project went awry. And he internalized each moment, quietly collecting lessons that would guide him for the rest of his life. One Saturday morning, they tackled a home project together, installing new shelves in the living room. Michael guided Ethan through measuring, marking, and drilling. Every step was slow and careful, and every mistake was treated as an opportunity to learn. See, Michael said as they adjusted a misaligned shelf. A small correction now prevents bigger problems later. Life's the same way. Attention to detail matters, even when no one is watching. Ethan nodded, repeating the phrase quietly to himself. It had become second nature: observe, adjust, persevere. Their weekends were no longer filled with quiet despair. They were filled with intentional moments: walks through the neighborhood, small games of catch in the park, visits to neighbors who had watched Michael struggle and now celebrated his resilience. Even the simple act of grocery shopping became an opportunity for teaching. Planning ahead saves effort later, Michael said, stacking cans carefully in the cart. It's the same at work, the same in life. Ethan absorbed it silently, already forming patterns of thought that would shape him far beyond childhood. He had become observant, patient, and remarkably thoughtful, a young boy whose wisdom exceeded his years. One evening, Michael sat at the kitchen table, reviewing a wiring plan for a client's home. Ethan perched beside him, quietly working on a model car. Michael noticed the boy's intense concentration and smiled. "You've grown so much," he said softly. "I see pieces of yourself in everything you do now. Care, patience, determination." Ethan looked up, smiling shyly. "I learned from the best." Michael felt a lump in his throat. He had doubted himself for so long, feared he had failed irreparably. Yet here was proof, living, breathing, learning, growing. His son had carried the wisdom Michael had instilled, even when he himself had nearly given up. The growth wasn't just in Ethan. Michael felt a new steadiness in himself. Each day he completed tasks fully before moving to the next, leaving encouraging notes, offering guidance without forcing it. He had learned that leadership, whether at work, at home, or in life, was less about perfection and more about showing up consistently, with integrity and care. One rainy afternoon, the electricity flickered briefly, startling Ethan. Michael reached out, steadying his son with a calm hand. "Remember," he said gently, "even when things seem uncertain, small effort lights the way. One step at a time." Ethan smiled. "I know, Dad. I can see the light." Michael realized that the boy had internalized the lessons fully, not just as words, but as lived understanding. It struck him how profound a child's faith could be, how it could guide even the adult who had lost his own way. They spent the rest of the afternoon building a miniature bridge for Ethan's model cars, carefully connecting each piece. Michael offered guidance without taking over. Ethan adjusted and corrected mistakes on his own, slowly gaining confidence, while Michael watched with pride. At the end of the day, Michael reflected on the months since Sarah's passing, since the warehouse accident, since the darkest nights of silence and fear. He remembered the heavy weight of despair, the trembling hands, the overwhelming guilt. And he realized how far they had come. He had learned that rebuilding a life, a home, a career, a father-son relationship, was not about one grand gesture. It was about small, steady steps. It was about consistency, presence, patience, and love expressed through everyday effort. Even when mistakes happened, and they always would, he had learned to adjust, repair, and move forward. And Ethan had learned the same. That evening, as they sat together by candlelight for their bedtime ritual, Michael whispered, "Even in the dark." Ethan responded, his voice steady, full of confidence, full of belief. "We find our way." The words no longer carried just ritual. They were truth. They were proof that even after loss, even after fear, even after failure, light could be restored. It had always been there, in presence, in effort, in the courage to try again. Michael looked at his son, now wiser, more observant than ever. He realized that the lessons he had imparted, carefully planted in the boy's mind, had grown into something enduring. The child he once guided now had the wisdom to guide himself, and perhaps, one day, others. The apartment, once filled with shadows and silence, now thrived with warmth, effort, and light. Tools were in their place, tasks completed, routines followed, laughter shared. Each day was a small victory. Each evening, a reminder that persistence mattered more than perfection. Michael understood at last that the most profound legacy he could leave wasn't money, work, or possessions. It was effort, patience, love, and wisdom, the quiet building blocks of life. And in Ethan, that legacy was alive, shining brightly. For the first time in a long time, Michael felt truly whole. Not because life was perfect, not because darkness had vanished completely, but because he had found the courage to keep moving forward, one small step at a time. And he had discovered, in the unwavering eyes of his son, that the light he thought he had lost had never truly gone away. Spring deepened into early summer, and with it came a quiet transformation in the Turner household. The apartment, once heavy with shadows, now thrived with the hum of daily life, the soft clatter of tools being used, the gentle murmur of conversation, and the laughter that had returned to fill corners long abandoned. Michael had regained confidence in his work. He accepted larger electrical repair jobs, not recklessly, but with careful planning and a renewed respect for the craft he had once loved. No longer did fear paralyze him. Instead, it informed his caution, sharpening his focus. He approached each project like he approached life itself, one step at a time, measured, intentional, unwavering. Ethan noticed the change, as he always did. The boy had become more than a witness to recovery. He was now a participant in life's lessons, absorbing wisdom through observation and practice. He began to take initiative in small ways, helping with minor repairs, organizing their tools, and even offering solutions when Michael faced a difficult problem. One afternoon, Michael and Ethan were installing a new ceiling fan together. Michael guided Ethan through each step, demonstrating first, then stepping back to let the boy try. "Watch the wiring carefully," Michael said. "Electricity is powerful, but controlled carefully, it serves us well. That's life too, energy, potential, responsibility. Always handle with care." Ethan nodded, recalling months of hardship and quiet lessons. He adjusted a wire, tightened a screw, and stepped back. "Like this, Dad?" he asked. Michael smiled, pride shining in his eyes. "Exactly. You see the light even in complex places." Outside, the city buzzed with its usual noise, but inside the apartment, a steady rhythm had taken hold. Chores were completed, tasks followed in order, and small successes, fixing a leaky pipe, repairing a lamp, cooking a meal, were celebrated. The most remarkable transformation, however, was not in the apartment or in their work, but in Ethan. The boy had absorbed every lesson his father had imparted. Courage, patience, resilience, the quiet discipline of showing up day after day, it had all become instinctive. In school, He approached challenges methodically, unafraid of mistakes. Among friends, he was observant, empathetic, and quietly wise beyond his years. One afternoon, as Michael reviewed an electrical schematic, Ethan sat nearby, reading a book and occasionally glancing over with thoughtful questions. "Dad," Ethan said softly, "why do we keep trying, even when it feels hard?" Michael paused, considering the boy's question carefully. "Because trying, even when it's difficult, creates light. It reminds us that even in darkness, we are moving forward. Effort matters more than perfection. And every small step adds up." Ethan smiled. "So, even when we stumble, it's okay." "Exactly," Michael replied, a warmth spreading through him. "Even when we stumble, we can keep moving. And the light comes from the effort we make, not the absence of mistakes." That night, their bedtime ritual carried a new depth. "Even in the dark," Michael whispered. "We find our way," Ethan responded confidently. The words were no longer a fragile routine. They were a promise, a truth they lived every day. Weeks turned into months, and the rhythm of life continued to strengthen. Michael no longer feared responsibility or failure. He had learned to trust himself again, while also trusting the small but vital wisdom his son carried within him. Together, they approached life deliberately, with patience and care. One Saturday, Michael allowed Ethan to plan their day entirely. The boy created a schedule, organized the tools, complete a small home repair, read, build a model, and end with a walk in the park. Michael observed silently, stepping in only when guidance was necessary. He realized, with quiet awe, that his son had absorbed the lessons completely. Ethan wasn't just applying them, he was mastering them. "You're growing into someone remarkable," Michael said, placing a gentle hand on Ethan's shoulder. Ethan looked up, eyes bright and thoughtful. "I learned from the best, Dad. And from the storm." Michael chuckled, remembering that pivotal night. "Yes. From the storm, and from every small step we took afterward." Even in the simplest moments, cooking dinner together, tidying up tools, reading quietly, the apartment radiated a light built not from electricity alone, but from effort, presence, and love expressed through discipline. Michael and Ethan had transformed daily life into a source of wisdom, joy, and resilience. Neighbors noticed too. They commented on the quiet strength in their home, the calmness in Ethan's demeanor, the steadiness in Michael's presence. What had once seemed like ordinary routines now revealed themselves as the extraordinary work of healing and growth. Michael began mentoring others at work, sharing his experiences and lessons with younger electricians. He spoke not only about technical skill but also about perseverance, patience, and the courage to keep trying despite setbacks. He realized that the wisdom he had imparted to Ethan could benefit others, and that teaching and guiding was another way to sustain the light he had fought to restore. Ethan, meanwhile, began to help friends with schoolwork, showing patience, empathy, and problem-solving skills he had learned firsthand. He reminded Michael that the smallest acts of guidance could shape someone's life just as profoundly as the largest ones. One evening, as they sat on the balcony watching the city lights twinkle in the distance, Michael reflected on their journey. He remembered the nights of darkness, the storm, the trembling hands, the doubts and fears. And he realized that every small effort, every act of presence, every tiny step forward, had brought them to this moment of light. "Dad," Ethan said, breaking the quiet, "do you think we'll ever forget those dark days?" Michael shook his head slowly, a soft smile forming. "No, but that's okay. Because they taught us everything we needed to know, about courage, about trying, about believing in each other." Ethan nodded, leaning against his father. "And we found the light together." "Yes," Michael said, looking out at the distant city glow. "Together." In that moment, father and son understood a profound truth. The brightest light is born not from perfection or safety, but from effort, love, patience, and the courage to keep showing up, even when the world feels dark. They had been tested, fractured, and challenged, yet here they were, whole, resilient, and shining with the quiet strength of shared wisdom. And in their home, every small act, every tiny effort, every word of guidance, continued to illuminate not just the apartment, but the path forward, for father and son, and for everyone who would one day learn from their story. By the time summer's warmth settled over the city, the Turner apartment was no longer just a home, it was a testament to resilience. Every corner, every shelf, every tool told a story of persistence, patience, and love. The apartment hummed not only with electricity but with the quiet, steady rhythm of a life rebuilt. Michael had fully regained confidence in himself. Work no longer frightened him. Instead, he approached each assignment with calm precision, guided by experience, caution, and the quiet lessons born from months of struggle. He took pride not just in finishing the job, but in the effort, discipline, and care he applied along the way. Ethan thrived as well. The boy had transformed from silent observer to a young person whose wisdom and maturity were striking. He approached school challenges thoughtfully, helped friends navigate difficulties, and applied lessons from his father's words and actions to daily life. Courage, patience, resilience, these were no longer abstract ideas. They were the foundation of who he was becoming. One Saturday morning, Michael and Ethan worked side by side installing a new lighting fixture in the living room. The project was simple, yet both approached it with the same care that had characterized every task in their home since the storm. "See these wires?" Michael asked. "They carry energy, yes, but the energy must be guided. Life is the same. We all have potential, but how we direct it matters." Ethan nodded, handling the wires carefully under his father's watchful eye. "Like when I choose how to respond to friends or school challenges," he said. "I direct my energy carefully, like you taught me." Michael smiled, pride swelling in his chest. "Exactly. And remember, even mistakes are just lessons guiding us toward the right path." The fixture was installed perfectly. The room glowed warmly, not from perfection, but from the careful, consistent effort that had brought them here. Later that afternoon, they sat together at the kitchen table. Michael looked at Ethan, reflecting on the journey they had endured, the darkness after Sarah's passing, the warehouse accident, the stormy night, and the months of steady rebuilding. He realized that each step, each small act of courage, had shaped not only their home but their hearts. "You know, Ethan," Michael said quietly, "I was afraid I'd failed you. I thought losing control, losing confidence, losing myself meant I could never guide you properly." Ethan looked up, eyes calm and wise. "But you didn't stop trying, Dad. Even in the dark, you kept showing up. That's why I can see the light now." Michael felt tears gather, but this time they were tears of gratitude and recognition rather than despair. The boy had internalized every lesson, not as fear, not as pressure, but as enduring wisdom. Courage, presence, patience, and effort. These were the gifts Michael had given, and Ethan had received them fully. The father-son bond had reached a new depth. It was no longer defined by teaching or guidance alone, but by mutual trust, respect, and shared growth. Michael realized that his role was not to shield Ethan from mistakes or challenges, but to guide him, model resilience, and allow the boy to shine in his own way. Even the small routines, breakfast together, small projects, notes of encouragement, bedtime rituals, now carried profound significance. Each act of care reinforced the lessons they had learned, that light is found in effort, presence, and the courage to try again. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the city skyline, Michael and Ethan sat on the balcony. The world outside glittered with streetlights, windows glowing like distant stars. Michael placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "Do you remember the first time you said, 'Dad, I can see the light'?" he asked. Ethan nodded, smiling. "I was trying to remind you of hope. I knew you could find it again." Michael laughed softly, a deep, relieved sound. "And you were right. I found it. And more importantly, I see it in you now." The boy's eyes gleamed with quiet confidence. He had absorbed more than lessons in wiring or household tasks. He had learned wisdom, resilience, and the subtle power of steady, consistent effort. He had learned that life, even after loss and fear, could be brightened by the smallest acts of presence and courage. That night, the bedtime ritual was no longer a fragile routine. It was a declaration of their shared strength. Michael whispered, "Even in the dark, we find our way," Ethan responded, voice steady, sure, and full of understanding. And as father and son sat together, the apartment warm and glowing, Michael understood the full meaning of the journey they had endured. The darkness had not broken them, it had taught them. The fears, the mistakes, the storms, they had all been steps toward something enduring: wisdom, resilience, love, and light. In the following weeks, Michael fully returned to work, respected by clients and colleagues alike. His skills were sharp, his confidence unwavering. He no longer feared mistakes but approached them as opportunities for learning and growth. Ethan continued to grow in wisdom and maturity, carrying his father's lessons into every interaction, every decision, and every friendship. The boy was observant, compassionate, and remarkably patient, a reflection of the quiet, consistent guidance he had received during the hardest months of his life. Together, father and son moved through life intentionally, understanding that the brightest light is born not from perfection or ease, but from effort, patience, and the courage to keep showing up. They had been tested by grief, fear, and darkness, but through it all, they had discovered that the smallest, consistent steps could illuminate even the most difficult paths. Michael looked at Ethan one last time before the boy drifted off to sleep. The room glowed softly from a lamp Michael had repaired earlier that day. The warmth and quiet strength in the space reflected everything they had rebuilt, not just a home, but lives, hearts, and a bond that could never be broken. "Dad, I can see the light," Ethan whispered one final time before sleep claimed him. Michael held back tears, smiling through relief and pride. The journey had been long, painful, and at times almost unbearable. Yet here they were, whole, shining, and resilient. The light had returned. Not from wires, not from bulbs, but from effort, love, patience, and the courage to keep trying. And as Michael sat in quiet reflection, he knew one undeniable truth: the light would never fade again. It lived within them, in small steps, quiet acts, and unwavering love. Summer gave way to early autumn, and with it came a rhythm that Michael Turner and his son, Ethan, had built carefully, step by step. Their home, once shadowed by loss and fear, now radiated warmth, laughter, and the quiet glow of effort fulfilled. Every corner, every shelf, every tool told the story of resilience. It wasn't perfection that defined their lives. It was persistence, presence, and love expressed in small, deliberate acts. Michael had fully returned to work. His hands, once trembling with fear, moved with confidence and precision. He no longer avoided difficult tasks. Instead, he approached challenges deliberately, understanding that mistakes were not failures but opportunities to learn. His reputation among clients and colleagues had grown, not just for his skill, but for his calm, steady presence and his ability to navigate life's inevitable obstacles. At home, Ethan had grown into a perceptive, wise young boy. He carried his father's lessons naturally, applying patience, courage, and thoughtful observation in every aspect of life. When challenges arose at school or with friends, he handled them with calm determination, never rushing, never panicking, and always remembering the wisdom his father had quietly imparted over months of rebuilding. One afternoon, Michael and Ethan worked together in the living room, assembling a new bookshelf to house Ethan's growing collection of books. Michael guided only when necessary, allowing Ethan to measure, drill, and assemble largely on his own. Mistakes were corrected gently, with words of encouragement rather than frustration. "You've learned well," Michael said quietly, watching his son work. "You see the steps even when things seem complicated." Ethan looked up, smiling. "I learned from the best, Dad. And from the hardest days." Michael felt a deep swell of pride. Those hardest days, the storm, the blackout, the months of darkness and silence, had not broken them. They had taught them. They had shown them that the smallest acts of effort, the quiet persistence of presence, and the courage to try again could illuminate the darkest paths. Evenings became their sacred time. Michael would prepare dinner, sometimes teaching Ethan to help, sometimes simply sharing quiet conversation. Afterward, they would settle for their bedtime ritual, the candle or lamp casting a soft glow across the room. Even in the dark, Michael would whisper, "We find our way," Ethan would finish, his voice calm, confident, and filled with understanding. Stories like this aren't about motivation. They're about becoming. If this resonated, like the video so it reaches someone who needs it. Subscribe for more wisdom-driven stories that can change how you see your life. And remember, progress is happening, even when it's silent.